Good afternoon, everybody. Actually, it's evening, but good evening. I hope you're all doing well. I apologize. This lecture is a little bit late, but we'll get you caught up. And I'm making a couple little adjustments to the syllabus as far as topics because with where we're at, I wanna cover a couple things a little bit differently. Um, I would like to dive in today in volume two, in chapter two, and start discussing some things centering around clarification, filtration, and finishing options. I'm going to get a water. I'll be right back. Normally, I just would have started over, but I'm allowing myself to be a little bit less of a perfectionist. If you could consider the type of videos that I make aspiring toward perfection. All right. So hopefully you have your text with you, and let's start pulling through a few of these topics. We've already talked about fermentation, and obviously that's a really big thing. Cleaning and sanitation we'll be covering as well coming up, another key element. But there's some really key points that we need to hit when it comes to actually finishing beer. So what we're looking at is we're looking at a situation where we have the beer in the fermenter. It's finished. It's cleaned up all of its own byproducts. So initial fermentation has happened, which means it's consumed the sugar that it's going to consume. The yeast has begun to settle out and to reabsorb some of the off flavors that it will produce during fermentation, potentially acetaldehyde, green apple, potentially diacetyl, depending on yeast strain, different things like that. And then we get that beer cold, okay? And traditionally what we would do at that point is be transferring the beer out of the fermenter cold into a bright tank. And that bright tank is going to be a dish-bottomed vessel. All right, so it's a slight curve on the bottom. And that is where we will be clarifying the beer, carbonating it, and getting it ready for packaging. All right. So this whole stabilization, fining, clarifying the beer thing is what we're really going to dive into today. And I want you to pull some very specific points out of this because it's quite crucial. You'll see some of the things that we discussed in class with packaging our own beers. So, yes. In chapter 2, question 1, this is in volume 2, what is beer stabilization? Stabilization is the process of preparing beer for serving or packaging. After stabilization, the initial fresh quality of beer is maintained over time. A brew pub may only have to ensure that beer is clear and fresh for 1 to 2 weeks, whereas a large brewery that exports to other countries may require up to 12 months of shelf life. Jumping down a little bit, this process may involve clarification, microbiological stabilization, or the removal of yeast and spoilage bacteria, and carbonation adjustment. Okay, so this is kind of what's going on in the bright tank. We're looking to stabilize this beer. We're looking to get it clear. And there's some different things, some different ways that we can attack that. Just to mention really quick that the 3 primary ways that we're going to be packaging beer is either into kegs, cans, or bottles of whatever size. Okay, and each one of those packages has its advantages. All right. The really traditional one is kegs. Kegs maintain a good seal. If you can store them cold, especially, it's all about cold storage once the beer is finished. Okay, if you can store the beer cold, the beer will remain fresh, assuming that the seal on top of the keg is good. All right. A lot of times when you get a clean keg ready to be filled, it'll already be pressurized. And so some breweries will go ahead and blow some of the pressure off of the keg to blow any remaining sanitizer that's in it out. that's pooled in the bottom. And it's also a good way to make sure there's still pressure in that keg, because if there's not still pressure in that keg, it's probably one with a bad seal that you wouldn't want to fill. So that's one kind of fail-safe that you have there. Bottling is very, very common as well. There's issues with bottling. Pretty much the worst thing you can do to your beer is put it into a bottle or can. Because it's going to be exposed to oxygen almost no matter how hard you try. And in the case of a bottle, even with a crown cap, which is better than a screw-on cap, you're going to get oxygen ingress into that beer, period. Especially if that bottle undergoes some heating and cooling. As that beer expands and contracts with heating and cooling, it's drawing an atmosphere from underneath the cap. Okay, cans are potentially a better package in comparison to bottles. With the liners that they have on them, they can protect from some of those old school off flavors that people would talk about with cans, like being able to say you can taste the metal and things like that. It's nice because they don't allow light in. And if you get a good seam on the can, you can prevent oxygen more readily than you can with the crown cap on a bottle. Okay, I do like when it talks about this, noting the difference between the difference in quality control between a brew pub and a large production place like Founders. And I think that needs to be talked about. Just because you're in a brew pub and you're going to move your beer quickly, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't take every single avenue that you can to make sure that your beer is going to stay fresh and shelf stable. But you have a lot more flexibility. When Founders is throwing gobs of all-day IPA into cans and shipping it to England, and it's stored warm, they have way different issues than what a brew pub is going to have, and there's more margin for error on the brew pub side. But again, however, even though you're at a pub, like I'm at a pub right now, I still treat the beer as if it's going away. It's your baby and you're sending it away and you have no idea how it's being treated. The more poorly it's treated, the more poorly it's going to drink. And so, yeah, I remember the first time I sent beer out for distribution at Crankers, and it was a nightmare for me personally. You might think that it would be cool to where, oh, you see your beer on the shelf. I hated it. Maybe I'm weird. I think people usually get excited about things like that. I hated it. And I hated it because I knew it was going to be stored warm. I was not assured that it was going to be rotated. We went through a period of using gold caps and black caps. I had been using gold caps for about a year, and then I went into a store in the middle of nowhere, and it had some of my beer, an IPA, with gold caps on it, meaning that was a warm stored IPA for a year. And whoever purchases that is going to think the beer is garbage. Because at that point it is, because it's old. You don't want to drink old IPA. It's a drink fresh beer. So, anyways, it's a spooky thing when you get into packaging. So anyhow, flowing right into question number 2, which is, what is shelf life? Shelf life is the period during which a beer remains saleable and conforms to the brewer's accepted flavor profile. Beer ages from the time that it is brewed. Listen to that. Beer ages from the time it is brewed. Most brewers agree that there is a beneficial aging that occurs in the lagering tank or bright tank or what have you. Green beer becomes smoother and more drinkable after a couple weeks. However, after beer has been clarified, stabilized, and packaged for sale, its freshness begins to deteriorate. I remember I was on a panel of professional brewers, and we were giving a talk at the Beer, Wine, and Food Festival. And Jacob Durillo from Brewery Vivant, people were asking him about their can releases and stuff. And he just said, he goes, it's the worst thing you can do to beer, is put it into a package. We all hate it. It sounds weird, but we all hate it. It's not just because it sucks actually bottling beer because it is one of the worst jobs in the brewery. Um, but it's the worst thing you can do for it. The best thing to do is to take it from a bright tank to a keg and then sell it on draft through clean draft lines. That's the dream. But when you're putting it into a can or bottle, or oh, geez Louise, you never know exactly what's going to happen. However, after beer has been clarified, stabilized, and packaged for sale, its freshness begins to deteriorate. If steps are taken in the brewery to ensure sanitation, selection of good raw materials, good oxygen control, that's a huge one, we're going to come back to it, and gentle treatment of the beer and so forth, the flavor profile of the beer will be maintained for a longer time, and the beer will be as fresh as possible when it reaches the consumer. So, this idea of dissolved oxygen. You want to take every single step. That bright tank that you're going into, transferring your beer from your fermenter into your bright tank, you want to make sure it is as purged as possible. Preferably, you can have a meter on your tank that can show you what parts per billion oxygen you have coming out of your tank when you purge it with CO2. It's a major, major thing. All right. The lower your dissolved oxygen, the better your beer is going to, the longer your beer is going to be stable on the shelf. All right. Obviously, contamination, all those other things, but dissolved oxygen is a huge one, especially for hop forward beers. Especially for hop forward beers, you can oxidize those hop flavors and aromas so quickly. Those beers are so fragile. I always harp about that, but it's so true. But it's so true. Like, for instance, you can, when I was making Professor at Crankers, that beer did not last on the shelf as well as Coconut Porter. And Coconut Porter was a big dark beer, not big dark beer, it was 6% dark beer. And that beer was kind of bulletproof. Our Irish Red, which was on the darker end of the style spectrum, it had more color in it. It was darker. It could stand up to a little bit of oxidation, and much better than a hop forward beer could. So yeah. Anyways, so dissolved oxygen is a huge one there. You want to reduce that as much as possible. Make sure your transfer lines are either packed with sanitizer and then they're dumped ahead of time, or that you have your transfer line sanitized and then you blow it out and purge that with CO2. Do everything you can. Okay? And we can walk through some of that a little bit in lab coming up when I can show you some of the options. Okay. Moving over to question number 4, when it asks about chill haze. There's a number of things in here, and some of them are more important than others, but I want to cover them. Chill haze is a non-permanent haze in beer formed by polypeptides or proteins in combination with polyphenols and tannins. They have a really long word for tannins, and I can't pronounce that. I'm not going to lie. You can say tannins. It is also referred to as a colloidal haze. Jumping down, chill haze forms when a beer that is clear at room temperature is cooled to serving temperature. We touched on this a little bit, all right? Because we talked about as the solution is warmer, particulate inside of it are going to stay smaller. As you drop the temperature of that liquid, that particulate is going to get larger as the particulate starts to stick together, okay? So this is why, which we're going to jump to when we're talking about clarifying a beer, you want to get it as cold as possible and make those particles glom together and get as big as possible so it's easy to pull them out of solution, okay? If you clarify a beer at 38 degrees and it's at 39, there can be haze in it, okay? That's why you want to get it as close to 30 without freezing the beer, and you can't go below 32 because of the presence of alcohol in the beer reducing the freezing temperature. So, chill haze tends to form in all malt beers and in beers made from high protein or poorly modified malts. There's other factors that help to promote haze formation, which includes a poor kettle boil. If you don't have a good kettle boil, a vigorous enough boil, you're not going to be slamming those proteins and polyphenols together and giving them a chance to actually form a clump. And forming that clump allows them to drop. High storage or lagering temperature, agitation in the package during shipping, high temperature storage of packaged beer during shipping or warehousing, dry hopping, high levels of dissolved oxygen, and poor initial filtration. Okay, mentions twice in their temperature. You want to keep beer as cold as possible. I forget which one does it. One of the Bud Miller Coors guys ships all their stuff cold because they're not dummies. All right, cold refrigeration, cold shipping. It's where it's at. You want your beer cold everywhere it can be. All right. Let's jump up to question number 9 with how is beer clarified? This is the smallest answer I think that they give in the text. And it says beer can be clarified by gravity over a long storage period or by the use of a fining agent, a centrifugal separator, or a filter. All right, and we'll get into those. We are not going to cover centrifuges all that much because very few people are using them. It's kind of a big boy thing, and a lot of people on the pub side are basically just going to be using finings, if they use finings at all. I always have. I think they're a miracle, and they're awesome, and I can sing the praises of some specific, a specific brand here when we get into that topic, even though I'm not sponsored. Is there a way to clarify beer without mechanical means? It says beer can be clarified to some extent by gravity over the course of time or by the addition of a fining agent in the lagering period. Jumping down, some ales are not intended to have long storage periods, and a fining agent is used to help yeast and protein flocculate and fall to the bottom of the tank, clarifying the beer more quickly. The fining agent increases the particle size by agglomeration and therefore increases the settling speed. Okay, we mentioned this, right? There's different ways that fining agents attach, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the main concept is what happens is it helps the solids glom together, get heavier, and drop. Okay, that's the main key. For pub type settings, and even other things, I know places that are doing 3,000-4,000 barrels a year, 5,000 barrels a year that use fining agents, and they thump it out. Okay, it's not an issue. There's places that filter, but there's issues with filtration. First of all, it's awful. That's another one of those jobs that I hate. I would rather scrub the floor on my hands and knees than filter a beer, but that's just me. Question number 11, what are finings? Finings are agents added to beer to aid in clarification. Various kinds of finings are used with different modes of action. I'm not going to require you to know like what each different one does or anything like that. I want you to understand the concept of finings. Some fining agents have an electrical charge, whereas others form chemical bonds with haze-causing compounds in beer. Some finings have absorptive power and act like a microscopic sponge to soak up haze-causing compounds. Some finings are used for specific problems in which a target compound reacts with the surface of the fining agent. The target compound attaches to the fining agent and larger particles are formed, which settle more quickly and completely to the bottom of the tank. There's a lot of different ways that you can fine a tank. On the home side, you can use gelatin. Professionally, you can use gelatin. You can use isinglass, which is derived from fish bladders. You can use silica gel. You can use a product I like called Biofine, and it is the real deal, all right? Biofine is really good stuff. And we will talk about that a little bit more after we talk about how finings are used in question number 12. Finings are typically added to green, freshly fermented beer on the way to the storage or lagering tank or bright tank. The beer is chilled in the tank or through a heat exchanger as close to 30 degrees as possible. Traditionally, what I would do is I would drop the fermenter as cold as I could, usually close to 32, depending on how powerful your chiller system is. This forms a haze and increases the efficiency of the fining agent because these particulates are solid, are as big as they're going to be. All right, they're going to be easier to pull out a solution. The fining agent is usually mixed into a slurry, depending on what kind of agent you're using. Biofine is just pour and measure and pour into your bright tank, or inject into your bright tank. The fining agent is usually mixed into a slurry in warm, deaerated water or beer and allowed to rest and hydrate. The slurry is then added to the beer as is being transferred from the fermenter tank to the storage tank. The best way to add finings is with an injection pump to proportion the slurry into the beer stream as the beer is being transferred. But the, quote, bucket through the door method works as well. I hate that concept of having a tank sanitized and purged and then you just open up the door to it and throw some stuff in there. There's other ways you can do it, which are probably better. The finings, yeast, and protein will settle with gravity. Horizontal tanks work well for settling by reducing the depth of the liquid and distance for particle settling, and therefore reducing the time required for clarification. So just to touch on that real quick, if you have a tank like this, taller than it is wide, it has to drop all the way down. It has to drop all the way down here. If your tank is this way, the beer only has to drop from here to here. Like in the keg that I use in class, that keg would get clear way faster if it were laying down on its side as opposed to being upright. Okay? A smaller channel with which to fall through. So you will see horizontal tanks sometimes. What I do is I use Biofine. I get my beer cold, I get my tank purged, and then as I'm adding, you can do it a couple different ways. What I've done is when I'm purging the tank, I will open the pressure relief valve on the top, so gas is coming out of there, and then I've add the fining agent there, both while I'm transferring beer in and when or before the tank is or before the tank has any beer in it. It's blown out of sanitizer, so the sanitizer is in there, but there's no pool of it in there. I'll add it, and then I'll start my transfer right away. You can also add it in line. There's different ways that you can do that too, but the key is you want it to be mixed thoroughly with the beer, and that's why you just wouldn't fill up a tank and then add this and then add the clarifier to it, because it wouldn't mix well. All right, usually after 12 hours the beer is bright, 12 to 24 hours, so it's killer. I use 16 ounces in 7 barrels, roughly, plus or minus a little bit. Actually, I use 66 mils per barrel, and there's a little bit of flex on either side of that depending on personal preference. But usually the next day you're thumping out bright beer. If you get it a couple days, it's going to be really bright. You might still have some haze off of it depending on what kind of beer you're making. Sometimes paler beers tend to stay a little bit more hazy, and your darker beers you can get brighter a little bit quicker. But yeah. So, and like I said, we will detail that a little bit more in lab on Thursday. To touch quick on filtration, I've used a plate filter before, and we were filtering our IPA with it. And what it is, it's a stack of plates that are hanging in a rack, and then you put filter pads between it, and you sandwich it all together, and you screw it down, and then you push the beer through there, right? The opportunity for oxygen pickup, and that is great. The volume of beer you lose doing that is great. You get really bright beer out the other end, but especially a beer like a dry hop beer, I would pull those pads out of there, those filtration pads out, and they would just stink like hops, like fresh, yummy hops. And I knew I was reducing aroma going into the bright tank, because it would be fermenter filter bright tank. And I knew I was reducing my overall volume, my aroma of that beer, and it took so long. It was really really a frustrating process, and then especially with the heavily dry hop beer, you would actually have to get to the point where you'd have to back flush it because it would clog, and you would have to reset the pads. It was very very difficult. You can use a filter like that. You can also use a DE filter or for diatomaceous earth. Diatomaceous earth is something you have to be really really careful of breathing. There's a lot of safety precautions in doing that stuff, and I'm not a big fan of it. It's another thing brewers are not crazy about doing. I'm wondering if I've told you what brewers are crazy about doing. I think I've only listed the things that we're not crazy about. We like making wort. It was like, packaging beer, serving beer, making beer, creating concepts, stuff like that. But some of the day-to-day stuff is work. Imagine that. So anyways, that's kind of your primer on packaging. And we're going to dig into that a little bit more in lab on Thursday. I'm going to be bumping back the brew day until the all grain brew day until next week, because there's a few more things that I want to be able to cover in class Thursday. I look forward to seeing you then, and I hope you have a great week.